There was one, alone, for possibly thousands of years. No mate. No herd. No one who understood a single sound she made. Every animal she had ever known was gone. Every instinct built for a world with others like her, useless now. She kept living anyway. How does an animal survive being the last of its kind? Not the last of a species that goes extinct all at once, in a single bad year. The last one left standing, for generation after generation, while everyone else who ever spoke her language was already dust. That's not a hypothetical. That's a real, documented event in the fossil and genetic record. And once you understand how it happened, you'll never think about extinction the same way again. Most people picture extinction as sudden. A meteor. A predator. A single bad season that wipes out a species all at once. It's clean. It's final. Everyone goes together. That's usually true. But not always. Genetic researchers studying certain isolated populations, Woolly Mammoths chief among them, found something that shouldn't have been possible. On a small island called Wrangel, off the coast of Siberia, mammoths survived for roughly 6,000 years after every other mammoth on Earth had already died out. 6,000 years. Alone on an island, cut off from the mainland population that vanished around 10,000 years ago. Let that sink in for a second. The pyramids were already ancient history by the time these mammoths finally disappeared. Here's where the story gets stranger. This wasn't one mammoth. It was a small, isolated population, a few hundred individuals, trapped on an island as sea levels rose and cut them off from the mainland. For thousands of years, they kept breeding, kept raising calves, kept surviving, completely unaware that everywhere else on the planet, their entire species had already ceased to exist. Which raises an unsettling question. What does it mean to be the last of something when you don't know you're the last? When your entire world is a small island, and nothing you've ever experienced tells you the rest of your kind is gone. For that population, there was no single individual carrying the weight of extinction alone. Not yet. But every generation, the island got a little smaller. The gene pool got a little thinner. And the mammoths kept doing what mammoths do, surviving, one bad decade at a time, completely unaware they were the final chapter of a 10-million-year story. Let's slow down here, because the science gets genuinely eerie. Researchers who sequenced the genomes of these late-surviving Wrangel Island mammoths found something they weren't expecting. Genetic mutations had begun piling up, mutations linked to problems with smell receptors, fertility, and even coat texture. Signs of a population so small, so inbred, that its own biology had started to break down from the inside. This wasn't predators. It wasn't disease sweeping through. It was something slower and, in some ways, more disturbing, a species quietly losing pieces of itself, generation after generation, simply because there weren't enough of them left to keep the gene pool healthy. Which means the ending, when it finally came, likely wasn't dramatic. No last stand. No final battle. Just a small, struggling population, growing weaker in ways individual mammoths couldn't have understood, until one generation simply failed to replace itself. Here's the twist that should really sit with you. We tend to imagine the last of a species as one tragic individual, alone, aware, mourning a world that's already gone. That image shows up constantly in nature documentaries. A single elderly animal, filmed in its final days, framed as the living end of something ancient. But the mammoths of Wrangel Island suggest something different, and honestly harder to process. There likely wasn't one dramatic, last mammoth. There was a population that kept shrinking, quietly, invisibly, until the very last individuals died without any grand narrative attached to it at all. No camera. No witness. No sense of ending. Just absence, where something used to be. This forces a harder question. If there's no single tragic survivor, no lonely final mammoth standing on a beach, watching the last sunset of her species, then where does the loneliness in the story actually live? Here's where it gets personal, in a way you might not expect. Elephants, the closest living relatives to mammoths, are deeply social animals. They form tight family bonds. They remember individuals for decades. Field researchers have documented elephants responding with visible distress when separated from their herd, pacing, calling out repeatedly, showing behavior that looks unmistakably like search and confusion. If mammoths shared even a fraction of that social wiring, and genetically, there's strong reason to believe they did, then every member of that shrinking Wrangel Island population would have felt something as the group grew smaller. Fewer calls answered. Fewer familiar bodies nearby. A herd that used to fill the horizon, slowly narrowing into a handful of faces you'd already known your whole life. That's a different kind of loneliness than the last one alive. It's the loneliness of watching your world quietly shrink around you, one missing voice at a time, long before anyone becomes the literal final individual. Let's push deeper into what this actually means. We like to think of extinction as something that happens to a species, in the abstract, a line on a chart moving toward zero. But for an individual animal capable of social memory, extinction isn't abstract at all. It's the slow, cumulative experience of a world getting smaller. Of routines that used to involve dozens of others shrinking down to a handful. Of silence where there used to be sound. This is where the story stops being just about mammoths. Because loneliness, in its rawest biological form, might not be about isolation itself. It might be about mismatch, a nervous system built for a certain density of social contact, forced to operate in a world that no longer provides it. An elephant calf separated from its mother experiences something different from an elephant that has simply never known a mother at all. The pain lives in the gap between what your biology expects and what your actual circumstances deliver. Apply that logic to Wrangel Island, and the picture becomes almost unbearably specific. Every generation there was built by evolution to expect a certain amount of social contact, herds, calls, movement, presence. Every generation actually received less of it than the one before. Not because anyone did anything wrong. Just because the island was small, and the population was shrinking, and evolution hadn't had time to adjust their expectations to match a world with fewer and fewer mammoths in it. Here's the detail that makes this even harder to shake off. Some of the last individuals in that population were likely born into a world already missing much of what their ancestors would have considered normal. Smaller herds. Fewer choices for mates. A landscape that, generation by generation, held less and less of what a mammoth's inherited instincts expected to find. They weren't just the last mammoths. They were mammoths raised in an increasingly hollowed-out version of what mammoth life was supposed to look like. Which means the loneliest mammoths weren't necessarily the very last ones. They may have been the ones in the middle of that 6,000-year decline, old enough to remember, in whatever way a mammoth remembers, a world with more others in it, and young enough to watch that world keep shrinking around them. Let's bring this back to the bigger question the title asks. How could an animal outlive its entire species? The mammoths of Wrangel Island suggest an answer nobody expects, not through strength, not through luck in the traditional sense, but through geographic isolation that protected them from a mainland collapse, while slowly creating an entirely different, quieter kind of ending. Survival and loneliness, in this case, weren't opposites. They were the same event, stretched out over thousands of years instead of compressed into one dramatic moment. We don't know, of course, what any individual Wrangel Island mammoth actually experienced. We can't interview a genome. We can't ask a 10,000-year-old matriarch what it felt like to raise a calf in a herd half the size her mother had known. But the pattern the evidence reveals, shrinking numbers, accumulating genetic damage, a species fading not with a single tragic death, but with a slow erosion of everything that used to make its social world whole, tells us something true about survival that goes beyond mammoths entirely. Sometimes surviving longer isn't the same as thriving. Sometimes outlasting everyone you're related to isn't a triumph. It's simply what's left when the alternative, dying alongside everyone else, all at once, never got the chance to happen. So the next time you imagine the last of a species, don't picture one dramatic individual on a wind-swept cliff, aware of everything that's been lost. Picture instead a population quietly shrinking for 6,000 years. Generation after generation, never knowing they were already the ending. Just living, adapting, raising young in a world with less and less of everything they were built to expect, until one day, without ceremony, there was nothing left to shrink. And if an entire species can vanish that slowly, that quietly, with no one left to notice the exact moment it happened, what does that tell us about the endings happening around us right now, too gradual for anyone to see?